Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into a medieval morning that is, how should I put it? Just damp enough to make you wish you'd worn boots, but cozy enough to smell like heaven if heaven was made entirely of carbs. It's early too. Early for anyone sensible. And yet here you are, standing in the shadow of crooked timber-framed houses in a narrow street known for one thing: bread. Steam curls from little chimneys, the kind of gentle ribbon-like smoke that tells you something. Warm and wonderful is happening inside. The cobblestones are slick, the air cool, and your toes are already questioning your life choices. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive here, between the lack of coffee and the suspicious puddles. You'd be down by lunchtime. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments. It's always fun to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The day is still wrapped in that grayish pre-dawn light, the kind that makes the edges of the world feel soft and undefined, like someone forgot to sharpen the picture. Your breath makes small clouds as you move, mingling with the scent of wood smoke and yeast. Somewhere behind a shuttered window, a baker's apprentice yawns, the sound muffled, followed by the clatter of wooden paddles being set down. You pause, letting the smell of rising dough slip in through your nose and settle somewhere deep in your stomach. To your left, an old bell tower looms, not the grand cathedral kind, but a stubby, practical one used to signal market hours. The bell itself has a slightly uneven tone, thanks to a hairline crack no one bothered to fix after the frost of last winter. When it rings later, the note will wobble, like a singer who's had one too many mugs of ale. In this town, that bell isn't just for telling time. It's a call to weigh the bread, a ritual as familiar as the sunrise. You step over a puddle that's reflecting the faint glow of lanterns. The water ripples when someone brushes past you carrying a basket linen covered, still steaming. The baker, a stout man with the kind of forearms that look like they've wrestled dough for decades, nods as he passes, not breaking stride. His tunic smells faintly of rye flour and ash. His eyes have that glazed, focused look of someone who's been awake for hours already. It's strange. There's no rush here. No frantic shoving like you'd expect in a modern coffee shop line. People move at the unhurried pace of those who know that bread, like gossip, can't be rushed. A couple of women are talking softly near a bakery door, shawls drawn tight, their conversation punctuated by quick bursts of laughter. You catch snippets, something about last year's flour shortage, and how the new baker down the street accidentally burned a whole batch. Historians still debate exactly when these tight-knit bread quarters became formalized in European towns. But what you're seeing now is already well established by the late Middle Ages. In fact, during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, regulations here were so strict that inspectors would weigh bread in public squares to make sure no one was cheating. Customers. A cart rattles into view, its wooden wheels sending little vibrations through the stones under your feet. On it, sacks of grain tied with rope, dusted with frost. The driver, a boy, really hums to himself, something slow and tuneless. A chicken in a wicker cage beside him lets out a half-hearted cluck, as if protesting the early start. You follow the cart for a moment, the wheels squeaking rhythmically, before the smell of another bakery draws you sideways into a narrower lane. This one is quieter. You hear only the steady thump of someone kneading, punctuated by the faint scratch of a mouse somewhere in the rafters. A window is cracked open, and a pale arm emerges to shake crumbs into the street for the birds. They descend immediately, sparrows, mostly fluttering in a chaotic little storm, their wings making a sound like paper fans. You duck your head to pass under a low lintel and find yourself in a space just wide enough for two people to pass. The walls here are leaning in toward each other, like they're conspiring. From one window, a child peers out, cheeks pink from sleep, holding a hunk of bread almost as big as her head. Her teeth leave small, determined marks in the crust. She blinks at you, then disappears back inside. Somewhere in the distance, there's a brief, bright sound, the striking of a small bell. Not the market bell. This one is lighter, quicker, almost delicate. You realize it's coming from a bakery where the master likes to weigh his loaves right there in front of customers. Each weight check punctuated with a cheerful chime. It's partly for show, partly to reassure buyers that they're getting exactly what they paid for. But there's also a quiet truth here. People trust the sound of a bell. A loaf that makes the bell ring is a loaf that passes inspection. You remember hearing once that in certain towns, bakers would intentionally make their bread heavier than the law required, by a small margin, just to avoid any accusation of fraud. 1 ounce extra was cheaper than a fine, and far more pleasant than public humiliation. That tradition might explain why some of these loaves look like they could double as doorstops. You linger outside the doorway, watching as a man inside dusts flour from his apron. He slides a paddle into the oven's mouth, pulling out a line of golden brown loaves that hiss softly as they meet the cooler air. The crust catches the light from the fire, a mosaic of cracks and ridges. He taps one with his knuckle. The sound is hollow, perfect. Without a word, he places it on a scale beside a polished brass weight. The needle settles exactly where it should. Somewhere the little bell rings again, sweet and certain. A dog pads past your legs, nose twitching, eyes locked on the bread. It sits expectantly at the doorway, tail sweeping the ground like a slow metronome. The baker glances at it, pretends not to notice, and then after a beat tosses a small crust toward the waiting jaws. The dog snaps it up without ceremony and trots off, mission accomplished. Further along, the street curves and you catch sight of the main square beginning to stir. A group of men are stacking kindling near the fountain, their breath visible in the cold. Someone coughs. Someone else laughs. And above it all, the faint creak of a pulley as another bakery hauls a sack of flour up to its loft. The rope fibers groan, the sack sways, and a thin trickle of grain escapes from a tier, falling like pale sand to the street below. The air shifts slightly warmer now, as the sun starts to push pale light between the rooftops. It paints the bread quarter in shades of gold and gray, softening the edges of every brick and beam. Somewhere the market bell will ring soon, and the official weighing will begin. But for now, you stand in the quiet in between, the world holding its breath before the day truly starts. And just as you take another step, you catch the faint scrape of a chair being moved inside the nearest bakery. Someone is getting ready for you to come in. Someone is ready to tell you about the first loaf of the day. You step over the threshold, and the warmth hits you first, soft and immediate, like stepping into a blanket that's been waiting just for you. The air here isn't simply warm, though. It's thick with scent. Yeast, of course, rich and a little tangy, but also the faint sweetness of malt, the sharper note of singed flour at the oven's lip, and an undertone of wood smoke that clings to the walls like an old memory. Behind you, the door swings closed, muting the street sounds into a faraway murmur, as if the outside world has already faded into yesterday. The baker is there, same one whose chair scraped against the floor in that small signal for you to come in. He's bent slightly over the workbench, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands cupping a mound of dough like it's something alive and delicate. Which, to be fair, it kind of is. He glances up, his eyes crinkling in that quiet, "You're welcome here" way people have when they're too busy to offer words. "Close the door proper, or you'll let the chill in," he says, voice low but edged with that firm warmth that sounds suspiciously like someone's grandfather. You nudge the door shut, the iron latch clinking softly, and step toward the counter. The heat from the oven wraps around you again, and you realize your cheeks have already picked up a faint flush. Somewhere inside that clay oven, the first loaf of the day is in its final minutes. The crust setting, the crumb tightening into the structure it's been building all night. It's almost theatrical. The way the baker moves, quiet, efficient, each gesture layered with muscle memory. He pulls a wooden peel from the wall, checks the oven with a swift, practiced lean, and then, with a movement so smooth it almost doesn't seem real, draws the loaf out into the open, and there it is, the first loaf of the day. Steam unfurls from it in slow curls, catching the glow from the oven mouth like wisps of gold. The crust is a deep, even brown, darker in the ridges where the blades scored it before baking. The smell hits you in waves, nutty, warm, and so deeply comforting you. Briefly consider abandoning every modern convenience to just live in this bakery forever. Of course, given that plumbing here is questionable at best, you'd last maybe 3 days tops. The baker sets the loaf down on the scale. Beside it, a brass weight gleams in the firelight. The needle hovers, settles exactly where it should. And the little bell rings, a bright, clear sound that seems to cut through the warm haze of the room. He nods, satisfied. "You can't rush the first one," he says, lifting it gently. "It's the one that tells you if the day will be good." You imagine him saying the same thing 30 years ago, maybe to an apprentice whose job was to sweep the flour from the floor. And honestly, there's truth there. If the first loaf is right, the rest will follow. You glance toward the window, where the light outside is shifting from pewter to something closer to silver. The baker notices. "They rang bells for this in London once," he says, almost conversationally. "Well, not just for this loaf. For all loaves. The assize of bread, back in the year of our Lord 1266. Law said how much it should weigh, and the price too. You short the customer, you paid for it in coin or shame." You nod, trying to imagine a city so wrapped up in bread law that an official bell might signal its weighing. He must see the thought on your face, because he smirks. "Better than the stocks," he says. "Those were for bakers who got too clever with their scales." Historians still debate whether every town enforced the assize with equal rigor. But here, it's clearly more than just law, it's pride. The bell isn't just a sound. It's a statement. While the loaf cools, the baker begins shaping the next round of dough. His palms press into it, stretching and folding, the rhythm steady as breathing. You lean an elbow on the counter, just far enough away to avoid the flour cloud rising like soft smoke from his work. "You ever hear about bread fines in Ghent?" he asks suddenly, glancing up. You admit you haven't. They'd weigh it in the market square, and if it was light, they'd make you carry it around on your head sign, and also everyone knew. Imagine walking past your neighbors while your bread sits up there like a crown of shame. He chuckles, a low sound that suggests he's just as glad those days are past. In the corner, a small kettle begins to hiss. He moves to pour water into 2 thick-walled mugs, sliding one toward you. It's not coffee, no such luck, but a mild herbal infusion that smells faintly of mint and chamomile. You take it, the ceramic warm against your palms, and sip. The taste is earthy, a little grassy, and unexpectedly grounding. Outside, faint voices drift in, a vendor setting up, a cart rolling over the stones. You're both quiet for a moment, listening. Then, as if remembering something, the baker picks up the first loaf again, wraps it in a square of linen, and offers it to you. "Here," he says. "Still hot. Careful." You take it, the heat seeping through the cloth into your fingers. It's heavier than you expect, solid, reassuring. The crust gives slightly under your touch, a faint crackle whispering at the edges. For a moment, you're not in a medieval bakery, you're in your own kitchen, maybe on a Sunday morning, holding a fresh loaf you didn't bake, but will claim you did if anyone asks. It's that universal moment of ownership, of knowing this bread is yours, at least until the last crumb disappears. The baker is already back at the bench, dusting flour, shaping, folding, turning. You watch him score the dough with a quick, precise slash. The blade he uses is narrow, sharp, and well-worn, its handle polished smooth from years of use. He doesn't look at it as he works, it's practically an extension of his hand. From the rafters, a little shower of flour dust drifts down, catching in the early sun that now filters through the small glass panes. You can see each particle. In the light, a lazy constellation suspended in the warm air. You ask how many loaves he'll bake today. Enough, he says without looking up. Enough for the town, enough for the poorhouse, enough so nobody says I came up short. His answer carries a weight beyond bread. It's a simple promise, but in a town where grain prices can spike overnight because of rain in a far-off field, enough is an act of both skill and luck. He gestures toward a shelf lined with cooling loaves, yesterday's. Still good, he says. Bread like this keeps well. Makes fine toast in the morning, or pottage. The word pottage drags you back to the reality that medieval breakfasts weren't exactly glamorous. No bacon and eggs here, no frothy latte with artfully swirled foam. Just thick slices of bread dipped in whatever was simmering over the fire, if you were lucky. And if you weren't, dry bread and a little ale to wash it down. One of the apprentices, a boy with hair sticking up like he's been in a flower explosion, appears from the back room, carrying a tray of small rolls. He glances at you then, at the loaf in your hands, and grins. First one's the luck one. He says that the baker snorts. Luck's got nothing to do with it. It's work. The boy shrugs, sets down the tray, and disappears again. The warmth, the smell, the quiet rhythm of hands on dough, it's almost hypnotic. You feel yourself leaning into it, letting the pace here seep into your own bones. In the corner, the little bell waits for its next ring, the brass glinting softly in the shifting light. Somewhere outside, a new sound begins, the faint creak of a cart loaded with something heavier than grain. The baker doesn't pause, but you see a flicker in his eyes, the kind that says he already knows who it is and why they're coming. And as the door latch lifts, you realize that whatever enters next might carry the day in an entirely new direction. The latch clicks up with a sound sharper than it has any right to be in a room this warm. The door pushes inward, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the faint rattle of chains against wood. A man steps through, broad-shouldered, face flushed. From the cold, his leather jerkin dusted with frost. Behind him, two younger men wrestle a flat cart through the doorway, its wheels complaining against the uneven floorboards. On the cart is a wooden chest, the kind that doesn't get opened. For casual business, the baker doesn't stop kneading, but you can see the set of his shoulders change. The smell of fresh bread still swirls in the air, but it's suddenly laced with something sharper: oiled wood, iron, and the metallic tang of cold air on steel. The man with the frost on his collar gives a short nod. "Morning, Thomas." The baker returns it, just as curt. "Morning, Will." The younger of the two helpers glances at you briefly, just long enough to do that medieval mental calculation of stranger or not worth noticing, and then goes back to unfastening the chest's iron latch. The sound is thick and final, like the lock has been waiting all night to be freed. Inside, stacked neatly on green baize cloth, are the official weights of the town. Brass, copper, and lead, each stamped with the seal of the mayor. This is the weighing table's morning ritual, part inspection, part ceremony. You get the impression that, much like your modern coffee machine, it happens every day without fail. And if it didn't, the entire place would grind to a halt. The table itself is simple, oak, dark with age. The surface worn into a slight dip in the center, where centuries of bread have been set for judgment. The brass scales gleam under the shifting light from the small high windows, their arms perfectly balanced, the pans polished to a dull sheen. You can smell the faint tang of old metal as Will lays out the weights in careful sequence quarter pound. half-pound, whole each landing on the wood with a muffled thud. It's not flashy, but it's got its own kind of gravity. Bit early for a weighing, you say without thinking. Will's eyes flick up, amused. Bread waits for no one. You're pretty sure someone's grandmother said that first. The baker steps forward, wiping his hands on his apron. The linen is streaked with flour, the creases so set in they might as well be part of the fabric. He places the still hot loaf you were holding earlier onto the left pan. A quarter-pound weight goes onto the right. The bean wavers, tips slightly toward the loaf. Generous today, Will says, a faint smile under his beard. Better over than under, the baker replies, especially when there's frost on the fields. There's a practical reason for that. Everyone in the room knows what happens when grain yields drop. Bread gets lighter, prices climb, and suddenly you have more people grumbling in the market square than you have loaves to sell. It's not just a food thing, it's a social stability thing. The French Revolution wasn't exactly about cupcakes. Will mark something down in a small ledger, the quill scratching across the page. You catch a glimpse of neat columns. Date, baker's name, weight, verdict. It's meticulous, the medieval version of a spreadsheet minus the part where you can hide columns to make it look like you've done more work than you have. The younger helper swaps the loaf for another, then another, until 4 are tested and logged. Each time, the scales swing slightly before settling, the beam cutting a precise horizontal in the air. The brass bell, yes, the same one from earlier, rings softly with each approval, as if to remind everyone that bread here is a measured, deliberate act. Ever weighed anything stranger? You ask, watching Will tuck the weights back into their cloth. He chuckles. Once weighed a man's boot. Claimed he'd lost his coin purse in it. Wanted to prove it wasn't stolen bread. Making him limp, and boot was heavier than the law said it should be. No coin purse. We told him to get new boots. Historians still debate whether medieval bread inspectors were more about fairness or control. But here, the mood is cooperative. It's not adversarial, not exactly. More like everyone is part of the same chain, each link checking the others. So the whole thing holds. A draft snakes across the floor as one of the helpers steps outside. The air it drags in is knife-edge cold, making the heat from the ovens feel twice as rich. You catch the faint scent of damp burlap and hay from somewhere beyond the doorway. The baker moves to a side shelf and brings out a smaller, darker loaf. It's round, crust mottled with flour, and you notice the uneven scoring, a sign it wasn't meant for sale. He sets it on the scales without a word. Will raises an eyebrow, but weighs it anyway. The bean dips, steadies. For the poorhouse. The baker says quietly, same as the rest. There's no joke in that, but there's a weight to it heavier than the loaf itself. Outside, the sound of church bells begins a slow, measured toll. The air in the room shifts again, almost imperceptibly. The baker glances toward the sound, his hands pausing mid-motion. Market's open, he says. And here I am still weighing bread. Will snaps the chest shut, the iron lock clinking into place. Then we'd better get out of your way. The helpers maneuver the cart toward the door, the wooden wheels groaning against the boards again. The cold rushes in as they leave, swirling briefly around your ankles before the door swings shut. The room feels bigger now, but also quieter. The baker stands at the table, palms resting on the wood, eyes on the empty scales. There's a faint furrow in his brow, the kind that says the morning isn't quite going to plan. You hear, faintly, the market beginning to hum outside, voices calling, carts clattering, someone laughing in the distance. But under it all, there's a thread of something else, something you can't quite place. The baker lifts his head. If you've never seen how grain comes into town, he says, you might want to step outside with me. And you realize that the day's warmth might not be enough to balance what's coming in with the next cart. The door closes behind you with a deep, satisfying thud. the kind of sound that seals in warmth and releases you into air that bites at your cheeks. You follow the baker down the short lane, your boots crunching against frost-hardened dirt. The sunlight is still pale, stretching long shadows across the cobbles, and your breath hangs in front of you in quick, ghostly bursts. Somewhere in the distance, a cartwheel clunks over a rut, followed by the faint protest of a mule. The street opens into the market square, already a slow tangle of movement. Stalls are half raised, bolts of wool catching the thin light, baskets of apples still rimed with frost. A fishmonger's table is set up near a drainage channel, the smell of brine chasing you faster than you'd like. The baker nods to a few people, but doesn't linger. His stride has a purpose that makes you lengthen yours. Your path threads between two timber-framed buildings until you're standing before the guild hall. It's taller than you expect, 3 stories, with a steep, red-tiled roof and windows set like watchful eyes. The carved beams along the front are blackened with age, but the detail still shows. Loaves, sheaves of wheat, the curling tails of barley. Above the door, a weathered sign creaks in the breeze, painted with the same brass scales you saw in the bakery. Stepping inside is like crossing into a different climate. The cold air gives way to a heavy warmth, not oven warm, but the close heat of bodies and candle smoke. Your nose catches a swirl of beeswax, old ink, and something faintly medicinal. Maybe from herbs hung to dry in the rafters. The light is dim, filtering through tall, narrow windows. The dust motes drifting like slow snowflakes. You hear the low murmur of voices. Before you see their owners, 3 men at a long oak table, heads bent over parchment. Quills scratch in. An unhurried rhythm, punctuated by the occasional clink of a seal press. The baker clears his throat, and the nearest man looks up, his gaze sharp despite the softness of the light. "Thomas," he says, "we've had word the northern grain shipment is late." The baker's lips press into a thin line. "Later missing." A pause. "Depends on who you ask." You shift slightly, trying not to draw attention, but one of the other men catches your movement and gives you that same stranger's measure you got in the bakery. It's not hostile, just inventory dash taking. The guild hall is more than a meeting place. It's the spine of the bread trade here. Rules are made in this room, disputes settled, fines decided. Historians still debate whether guilds like this kept order or stifled competition, but either way, their shadow stretched over every loaf sold in town. On the far wall hangs a tapestry. Its colors faded, but its story still visible. A procession of bakers carrying loaves to the market, each one followed by a man in a hood ringing a small bell. It's an old depiction of the assize of bread, the same law that once set bread prices across England after King John signed Magna Carta. A well-fed populace, after all, was less likely to start flinging pitchforks. "Come," the baker murmurs to you. He leads you to a side alcove where the air smells faintly of damp wool and ink. Here, the grain ledgers are kept thick, leather-bound, their pages crowded with neat, looping script. You glance over an open one. Tallies of sacks received, weights measured, names of millers and merchants. A younger clerk, barely more than a boy, approaches with an armful of folded papers. "From the western gate," he says, handing them over. His fingers are ink-stained, and he looks like he's been awake since before the bells rang. The baker skims a sheet, his brow furrowing. "2 carts short. Same as last week. That's not a pattern you want," you murmur. "No," he says, "it isn't." There's movement near the table. One of the older men stands, his chair scraping the flagstone floor. He walks to a side cabinet and unlocks it with a key that looks as old as the hall. From inside, he draws out a small lidded box and sets it on the table with a careful tap. The lid opens to reveal a set of smaller, more delicate weights than the ones you saw earlier. They gleam in the dim light, each marked with the town seal. "These," the man says, "are for the barley test." If the grain's light, the bread will be light. And if the bread's light, the bell rings for the wrong reasons. The baker finishes. The younger clerk gives you a faint smile, almost conspiratorial. We once caught a miller watering his grain sacks before weighing, he says quietly. Thought he was clever until the damp froze on the road and he couldn't lift them off the cart without tearing the sacks. Somewhere beyond the walls, a shout rises, muffled but urgent. The hall's atmosphere shifts subtly, but you feel it. Conversations falter, quills still. The baker exchanges a look with the older man, then turns toward the door. Outside, light has changed. Clouds have drawn over the sun, and the wind carries a sharper bite. Down the lane, you see a group gathering, their shapes blurred by the movement of a cart being pulled to a halt. Even at this distance, you catch the shimmer of frost on the canvas covering the load. The baker glances at you once. You came to see grain arrive, he says. Best we don't keep you waiting. And together, you step into the cool shadow of the hall's doorway, toward whatever the crowd is already circling. You step out of the guild hall's shadow and into the pale, strained daylight, the kind of light that makes colors feel like they've been washed one too many times. The crowd down the lane has thickened, its edges a restless shuffle of boots and murmurs. The frost-dusted cart sits in the center like an unwrapped present nobody's sure they want. The smell hits you before the sight does, a mix of damp grain and horse sweat, with an undercurrent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. It's not unpleasant, just earthy in a way that clings to your clothes. The baker pushes forward, the crowd parting reluctantly. A man in a weather-beaten coat is already tugging back the canvas cover. Inside, the sacks are smaller than you'd expect, their tops twisted and tied with rope. You can hear the faint shush-shush of loose grain shifting inside as one is lifted. But it's not just the sound, there's a look on the faces around you. A silent conversation and raised eyebrows and slow exhalations. One of the guild men from earlier arrives, breath steaming, and clears his throat. We'll weigh it here. The scale is brought out, a sturdy wooden frame with iron arms, its pans dulled from years of use. It's the kind of tool that seems incapable of lying, though you know better. Even honest scales can be coaxed into dishonesty if someone's clever enough. The first sack is set down with a muffled thump. A brass weight, stamped with the town's crest, is placed on the opposite pan. You watch the beam sway, slow as a pendulum, before settling just shy of level. The baker's eyes narrow. That's light, he says. The man with the cart shifts uncomfortably. Road was bad. Lost some on the way. Lost? The guild man raises an eyebrow. Not spilled, not stolen, just lost. A few chuckles ripple through the onlookers, the kind people make when the joke isn't really funny. The air feels tighter now, like the clouds have dropped lower. The baker glances at you and murmurs, "This is where the law comes in." It's not just any law, it's the assize of bread and ale, first laid down in the reign of Henry III in 1266. The rule was simple in theory. The price of bread was fixed according to the price of wheat, and bakers were legally bound to give the correct weight for the money. In practice, it meant that if grain was scarce or expensive, loaves got smaller, but the price stayed the same. And if bakers shorted customers, they faced fines, public shaming, or worse. The worse was creative. There's a lesser-known punishment called the pillory loaf, where an offending baker's bread was nailed to the pillory for all to see, along with the baker's head and hands inside it. Public humiliation was the medieval version of a bad Yelp review, except you couldn't scroll past it. Think of it like a customer complaint, you say. But instead of getting a coupon, you get rained on by turnips. The baker smirks. Turnips if you're lucky. Rotten eggs if you're not. Another sack is lifted, another weight measured. This one is even lighter. The guildman's voice tightens. By the king's law, we take what's owed. He gestures, and two younger men begin unloading the shortfall, scooping grain into separate sacks marked with a charcoal X. The merchant protests, voice rising like steam off a boiling pot. But the law is the law. Historians still debate whether these regulations truly protected the poor or simply kept bread under the control of those in power. Either way, they were enforced with a consistency that made the ringing of a bell more than just a sound. It was a warning, a reckoning. You notice a boy near the edge of the crowd, his bare hands red from cold, eyes fixed on the sacks being carried toward the guild hall. Bread'll be dear this week, he says to no one in particular. Or thin, someone replies. The baker sighs. If the loaves shrink any more, we'll be selling crusts on strings. That's called a bagel, you murmur. But the joke doesn't quite land here. The weighing continues, methodical and unhurried. The iron beam swaying and settling like it's measuring more than just grain. Somewhere in the background, a church bell tolls the hour, its sound rolling over the rooftops. It blends with the metallic clink of the brass weights, a strange harmony of faith and commerce. A woman in a wool hood leans toward you. They caught a baker in York once, selling loaves stuffed with stones. Stones, you echo. Makes him feel heavier. Until you bite in. You try to picture that in a modern bakery, maybe a sourdough with a surprise center nobody asked for. When the last sack is measured and the shortfall recorded, the guildmen confer quietly. The merchant is handed a slip of parchment, part receipt, part warning. The crowd begins to thin, boots scraping against the frost as people drift back to their stalls or homes. The baker stands beside you, watching the cart being led away lighter. Then it arrived. The law keeps us honest, he says, but it also keeps us bound. Break it, and you're marked. Keep it, and you're still marked in a way. The clouds shift, letting through a brief shaft of sun that glances off. The damp cobbles. The light doesn't last long, but it's enough to catch on something in the baker's expression. An unspoken thought, maybe, about how rules work best on paper, and life works differently on the street. He turns back toward the guild hall. There's something else you should see, he says. The way he says, it makes you think it's not on any parchment, and no weight or bell could measure it. The baker's boots crunch over frost as he leads you down a narrow lane, away from the market's fading noise. The buildings lean close here, their upper stories like gossiping neighbors trying to hear one another over the street. The air smells sharper, less wood smoke, more cold stone, and every sound is sharper too. The click of your heel on a stray cobble, the swish of a curtain drawn aside in a window above. You round a corner, and the lane widens into a yard with a low-roofed structure. At its center, the door is thick planks, bolted with iron, and when the baker pushes it open, a wave of warmth and scent rolls over you. It's not the buttery sweetness of a bakery. It's deeper, earthier, with a faint malted edge. You step inside and see rows of wooden bins, each one filled with grain that catches the dim light like gold coins underwater. This, the baker says quietly, is where bread begins. Your breath fogs faintly, even indoors. It's warmer than outside, but not by much. The light comes from small, high-set windows where frost flowers trace the glass. A single cat stretches on a sack near the wall, tail twitching in a way that says it takes its rodent-catching contract very seriously. Somewhere in the rafters, a pigeon shifts, the rustle sounding like paper being crumpled. The baker scoops a handful of wheat and lets it run through his fingers, the grains clicking softly against one another. Every year, the quality changes. Too wet in the summer, you get sprouted grain. Too dry, it's light and dusty, and if the harvest fails, bread gets smaller, you say. He nods, or dearer, or both. The air smells faintly of burlap and dust, the kind that settles in your nose and throat and makes you want to sneeze. You resist, partly out of politeness, partly because the cat is watching you like it might file a report. This is why the guild tests every load, he goes on. Weight tells part of the story, but it's not the whole of it. He moves to a table where a small set of brass measures sits beside a scattering of kernels. Moisture matters, color, even the sound. The sound? You ask. He smiles faintly. Good wheat rings when you drop it. You pick up a few kernels and let them fall back into the bin. The sound is tiny, almost lost in the stillness. But you hear it. A faint, bright tick like raindrops on tin. In 1315, you're reminded a series of cold, wet summers across northern Europe caused what historians call the Great Famine. Crops failed, grain prices tripled, and in some places, seed grain meant for planting was eaten just to survive. Bread wasn't just smaller, it vanished from tables altogether. That was the kind of scarcity that rewrote laws, reshaped towns, and left more graves than loaves. The baker runs a thumb over a barley grain. We mix sometimes. Not everyone admits it, but we do. Barley, rye cheaper, easier to grow in bad soil. Some years, it's the only way to keep bread on the table. You can't help but imagine this in modern terms. A fancy cafe chalkboard proudly announcing its artisanal multigrain loaf, when in reality, it's a survival strategy. Historians still debate how much of that mixing was practical. And how much was profit, he adds. The cat hops down and pads toward the door, pausing to glance back at you like it expects you to follow. You do, because cats tend to know things. Outside, the yard opens toward the river. The water moves slow, edged with ice where it meets the bank. You can smell the faint mineral tang of it even from here. There's the other half of the story. The baker says, nodding toward the current. Grain comes in by road or river. If the river freezes early or floods in spring, we lose weeks. You picture the frozen Thames during the winter of 1683 to 84, when it turned into a frost fair, with booths and even ice bowling. Here, a frozen river wouldn't mean merriment, it would mean hunger. The baker squats near a pile of damp sacks. This lot came upriver last week. See that? He points to a dark patch creeping across the cloth. Mildew. Won't kill you, but it'll make bread taste like old cupboards. Sounds gourmet, you say. He chuckles, then straightens, rubbing his hands against the cold. We'll dry what we can. The rest goes to livestock or the brewer, if... He's desperate. The sky is paling toward noon, though the sun is no warmer for it. You hear a low creak as a flat-bottomed boat bumps against the dock. Two men in heavy cloaks begin unloading more sacks, their boots thudding against the wet planks. The grain hits the dock with a soft, heavy hump each time, sending up tiny clouds of chaff that catch the light. The baker watches, then says quietly, "Come, I'll show you how we judge if a year will be lean or fat." You follow him into a small shed, warmer and darker than the yard. A single lantern swings gently from a hook, its flame making the shadows bend and sway. On the table is a wooden trough half filled with wheat, a jar of water beside it. "Float test," he explains. He drops a handful of kernels into the water. Some sink immediately, others bob at the surface like lazy swimmers. Heavy grain means it's full. Light grain means air inside, less nutrition, less weight. You can bake with it, but it's like filling a shopping bag with crumpled tissue paper instead of groceries, you finish. Exactly. The shed smells of damp wood and warm. Metal from the lantern. Somewhere outside, a gull cries, sounding oddly lonely. The baker drains the water and spreads the grain on a cloth to dry. His hands move with the kind of practiced efficiency that says he's done this hundreds of times. You watch for a while, the soft patter of grain on cloth oddly soothing. Then he looks up, his expression shifting slightly. You've seen the grain, the law, the scales. Now it's time you see the part that really keeps bakers awake at night. The way he says it makes you think it's not the cold, or the weight, or even the law. It's something else entirely, and it's waiting. Just beyond the next door. The baker doesn't knock, he just pushes through the shed's far door into a wall of sound so sudden you actually take a step back. Bells. Not one or two, but a tangled chorus of them, high and bright, their tones skipping over each other. Like children in a race no one agreed to start. The cold outside seemed sharp before, but here the air is alive with the vibration of metal, and it tickles the inside of your ears in a way that makes you want to rub them. You squint against daylight spilling in from the market square beyond. It's not warm light, more the pale wash of winter sun, but it dances off polished brass and tin like water over stones. The smell hits next. Hot bread from a nearby stall, tangy yeast, a faint undertone of frying onions, and somewhere in there, the sharp little bite of brass-polished dot. The baker moves ahead, weaving through stalls strung with goods apples with frost on their skins. Ropes of onions, bolts of wool so bright, they look almost defiant against the season. But it's not the produce sellers who draw the crowd. It's the platform in the square's center, where a man in a long apron is hanging a small set of bells from a scale beam. The crowd shuffles closer, boots grinding grit into the frozen ground. Thought you said the bells were for churches, you murmur to the baker. They are, he says. And for weighing bread. Of course, you say flatly. He grins at your expression but doesn't explain right away. Instead, he pulls you closer to the platform. The bells aren't church-sized, no swinging giants here, but little brass ones, each marked with a number and polished to a mirror gleam. In the apron lifts a loaf from a basket, sets it on the scale, and then adds bells to the other side until the beam balances. The bells ring softly as they touch, each note a clear, quick shimmer. The sound is absurdly delicate for something so practical, like paying your taxes in harp chords. A woman in the crowd nudges her friend. That's short by a farthing loaf, she says. The baker leans toward you. They used to do this with plain weights, but the bells make cheating harder. You can't slip a little extra lead on the pan without changing the sound. You picture a medieval infomercial. Tired of dishonest bakers? Try new Bellomatic scales. The man on the platform sets the offending loaf aside, makes a note on a wax tablet, and gestures for the next one. The process repeats: loaf, bells, ring, murmur, like a ritual everyone knows by heart. You watch, hypnotized. The air is cold enough to sting your fingers, but the bell's bright tones cut through it like sunlight. Somewhere nearby, a child laughs, the sound merging with the bells in a way that makes you think of coins tumbling into a cup. During the Great Fire of London, the baker says casually, some bakers claimed they'd lost their weights in the blaze. They tried to guess loaf sizes by sight alone. And how'd that work out? They were fined, he says dryly. Or worse, pilloried. You ever stood in stocks with freezing wind and a face full of cabbage? I'm going to guess. No, keep it that way. The platform official pauses to adjust the bells, swapping a heavier one for a lighter. The sound shifts a slightly lower chime that makes the crowd murmur approval. It's strange to see them react to sound the way you might to a price tag dropping in your favor. You edge closer and notice the bells aren't all the same shape. Some flare outward like little skirts. Others taper to narrow lips. A few have faint patterns etched into them, swirls, dots, even what looks like a tiny loaf stamped near the base. The etching catches in the low sun, flashing like fission. Stream. The baker notices you looking. Each bell's a known weight: quarter, half, full loaf. Etching marks stop anyone from swapping them for counterfeits. Counterfeiting bread bells, you say. That's specific. He shrugs. People counterfeit anything. In Bruges, there was a man who tried to pass off painted pebbles as peppercorns. That image sticks in your head, someone squinting suspiciously at their stew, wondering why their pepper tastes like gravel. The bells chime again, this time at a run that sounds almost musical. You glance at the baker. Do they ever play tunes? Once, he says, at the Midsummer Fair. Weighing contest turned into a song contest. Got shut down when someone tried to dance on the platform. The cold nips at your ears, so You pull your cloak tighter. Around you, steam rises from the pie seller's cart in thick, fragrant ribbons. Somewhere behind, a smith's hammer rings out lower, heavier than the bells but strangely in harmony. The marketplace is a choir, you realize. Voices, hammers, bells, footsteps, all layered into something that feels alive. You look back at the platform, just as the official lifts the heaviest bell, a deep bronze one that rings with a mellow note you can feel in your ribs. The crowd stills for a moment, as though the weight has a kind of authority. When it settles onto the pan, the loaf on the other side finally balances, and the official nods. Approved. The baker leans close, voice low enough that only you hear. That sound, that's what lets us sleep at night, or keeps us awake. The wind slides through the square, lifting a scatter of chaff into the air. One piece lands on the bell's rim, clinging there until the next chime shakes it free. You watch it drift upward, caught in a shaft of pale light. Before it disappears, the baker's gaze follows yours, and for a moment, his expression is unreadable. Then he says, "There's one more place you should see, the place where those bells are made." The way he says it makes the square feel suddenly smaller, as if the real weight in this story isn't in the marketplace at all, but waiting somewhere behind the forge's smoke. You're still squinting toward the forge's chimney when the bells on the weighing platform give a sharper ring, not the usual delicate chime of a loaf being tested, but a clipped, almost metallic snap of sound that hushes the murmuring crowd. It's the kind of pause you'd hear if someone clinked a glass at a wedding, but instead of toasts, it's announcing trouble. From the north side of the square, a figure in a fur-trimmed cloak appears, striding with the confidence of someone whose boots have never once been splashed by slush. His hat's brim is stiff with frost, his gloves spotless. The baker mutters under his breath, "Inspector." It's not a greeting, it's the word you use when you've just spotted your least favorite teacher at the mall. The man reaches the platform, doesn't remove his gloves, and immediately flips open a leather-bound ledger. The parchment inside crackles like thin ice. You catch the faint smell of beeswax polish from his cloak, the faint tang of iron from the ink nib in his other hand. His voice, when he speaks, is perfectly even, like each word has been weighed on a scale of its own. Proceed. The official. At the scales nods and starts again. Loaf, bell, ring. But this time you notice the inspector's gaze darting between the weights and the loaves with unnerving precision. The sound of the bells is still beautiful, but it's got an edge now. Like a song played in a minor key. The baker leans closer to you. Every few months, they send him. Checks the scales, the bells, the loaves, and the bakers. And if something's off, you whisper, fines, stocks, public shaming. Once they made a man bake bread for free for a whole winter. You blink. That doesn't sound ruinous. Try paying your rent with exposure, he says. The inspector pauses mid-page. This one, he says, pointing to a loaf. It's a small rye, crust baked so dark you can't tell if it's from the oven or the flour. The official weighs it. Chime, another bell. Chime, the bean dips low, too low, short by an ounce. The inspector says without looking up. Baker beside you stiffens, and you realize it's not his loaf this time, but his jaw still tightens as though it could be. The crowd murmurs, and a few eyebrows lift. In this place, an ounce is a lot. It's the difference between an honest trade and suspicion. The baker sighs. It's like the Battle of Hastings, really, he says softly. You tilt your head. In what way? Everyone remembers who lost, even if they can't name the winner. The crowd laughs a little when the inspector makes a note in his ledger. Not a warm laugh, more the kind you hear when people smell gossip brewing. Historians still debate. The baker says in an offhand tone, whether these inspectors kept bakers honest or just scared them into baking heavier loaves than they could afford. You imagine the inspector as some kind of medieval food influencer, holding loaves up to the camera and saying, "This, not worth your farthing." A boy pushes forward with a tray of rolls, eyes wide. The inspector weighs one, then another. The bells sound almost tentative now. He approves them with a curt nod, and you can see the boy's shoulders drop in relief. The baker watches this with the faintest smirk. First inspection? The boy nods. Yes, sir. Eat something. The baker says, You're shaking like you've been left outside the tavern in January. The inspector moves to the larger loaves, big, round things dusted with flour, like they've been kissed by snow. You notice he uses a slightly different bell for these, a deeper tone that resonates longer. The sound is so warm and low, it's like being wrapped in a wool blanket. And yet, you swear the inspector's lips twitch into something between a frown and a smirk when he hears it. Why does that one sound different? You ask the baker. Because it's a pound bell, he says. Old measure, same since before the plague years. That's comforting. Until you learn the plague killed so many. Some towns have the standard loaf size just to stretch flour farther. The inspector glances your way, and for a second, you feel pinned, as if he can measure you without scales. Then he turns back to the loaves, flicking his ledger shut with a snap that feels final. All in order, he says, except for the one short rye. See that it doesn't happen again. The offending baker nods stiffly, already knowing the whole square will be talking about him until the next scandal. The inspector steps down, cloak swaying, and heads toward the forge, the same direction the baker had pointed before. His boots crunch on the frost, each step crisp as a page-turn dot. The baker waits until he's just far enough away before muttering. He'll be wanting to see the bell founder's records. You can't bribe sound, at least not easily. Your breath fogs in the cold, and the sunlight is thinning, sliding lower until the stall's shadows stretch across the cobbles. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, the sound bouncing off stone like a faint echo of the bells. The baker starts walking, and you follow, weaving through the crowd. You pass a woman selling roasted chestnuts. The sweet, nutty scent curls into the air and clings to your scarf. Somewhere nearby, someone is roasting meat on a spit. The fat hissing on coals sends up a scent, so rich it momentarily drowns out the cold metal tang you've carried since the inspector appeared. You catch the baker's eye. You don't like him much, do you? He snorts. He's not supposed to be liked. He's supposed to make you wonder if he'll turn up in your shop tomorrow. That's effective. Effective, he says, and exhausting. The forge smoke is thicker now, curling in lazy ribbons that smell of scorched metal and charcoal. The inspector is already there, his shape blurred by the haze. He disappears inside without looking back. The baker pauses at the threshold, letting. You feel the heat rolling out dry, almost sandy heat that catches in your throat after so much frost-bitten air. The anvil rings once from inside, a note lower than the bells but with the same clean edge. You're about to see. The baker says, why those bells sound the way they do, and why no one argues with them for long. And with that, he steps into the glow, leaving the winter light behind you like a door slowly closing. The moment you step into the forge, the air grabs you thick, dry heat wrapping around you like you've just walked into a laundry room mid-cycle, only with the smell of scorched metal instead of detergent. The light is molten and low, flickering, off the curve of brass bells hanging from the rafters like a chorus waiting to be called. Somewhere behind the glow, the inspector is already speaking in that unhurried, measured tone of his, each word falling like a hammer strike. You follow the baker further in, your boots crunching on a grid of ash and iron filings. Sparks arc from the bell founder's anvil, their glow briefly painting the inspector's face in sharp orange. He's looking at a ledger again, though this one is thicker, edges smudged with soot, the kind of book that's been handled by hands with more calluses than clean fingernails. Master Ulrich, the inspector says, your weights are consistent. Ulrich, a mountain of a man with arms like barrel staves, grunts. They'd better be. You'll not find a hollow bell here. The baker leans toward you. Hollow bells, he whispers. Sound wrong, but some smiths used to thin them to cheat. The weight. Got caught, they'd pay for it. How bad are we talking? You ask. He smirks. Let's just say it made tax season look like a birthday party. The inspector turns a page. 2 incidents last quarter, both underweight loaves. 1 find. 1 corrective service. Ulrich's face hardens. Ah, the stocks. You can almost feel the heat behind those words. Apparently, in this town, if you shorted the bread, you didn't just pay a fine, you might spend an afternoon locked in. Wooden stocks in the square, while every passing neighbor got to express their feelings about your baking. The baker tells you it could involve verbal insults, the occasional thrown turnip, and if your enemies were feeling theatrical, a chicken tied to your arm for company. Historians still debate. He says dryly, whether the chicken part was symbolic or just local entertainment. The inspector flips the ledger shut. Weights are approved. Keep them that way. Ulrich nods, but his eyes flick to you. Want to see the punishment bells? The baker answers for you. Yes, they do. In the corner of the forge, away from the gleaming row of market bells, hangs a smaller, rougher set. Their surfaces are pitted, their edges uneven, and each has a deep gouge where the weight mark used to be. These, Ulrich says, don't weigh bread anymore. They hang over the square when someone's been caught cheating. 1 for each offense. You run your fingers near, but not on the cold brass. The smell here is sharper, tinged with old ash, so everyone hears the sound and knows who it's for. Exactly, the baker says. It's like your name trending on social media, only it's an actual bell, and you can't delete it. Ulrich chuckles, low and deep. My grandfather told me during the famine of 1315, the bell rang so often the clapper cracked. They had to use a ladle from the soup kitchen until the founder made a new one. You glance at the baker. That's the Great Famine, right? He nods. Europe, crops failed 3 years straight. People didn't just skimp. They swapped grain for ground-up acorns or dried moss. Made the bread taste like a barn floor. You picture the punishment bells ringing over such a winter, each note a public reminder that trust, like bread, could go stale fast. The inspector clears his throat, drawing both men's attention. There will be a posting, he says. The underweight rye. Name, offense, and penalty. What penalty? You ask before realizing you weren't really supposed to speak. He looks at you, mildly amused. A fine 2 shillings. Enough to sting, not enough to ruin. The records keep. The rest. The baker murmurs. 2 shillings could buy flour for a week, or ale for 2 nights. Either way, you'd miss it. The forge heat presses closer, and for a moment, you feel as though the bells are watching you, silent, but still heavy with consequence. Ulrich turns back to his work, hammering a bell rim until it sings a pure, single note that hangs in the air like a ribbon. Different from the market bells. You say, punishment bells, he says, aren't meant to please the ear, they're meant to be remembered. You think of the rye loaf from earlier, its missing ounce immortalized in a clang, and you shiver despite the heat. The inspector gives Ulrich one last nod, then heads toward the door. Cloak stirring the forge dust, the baker gestures for you to follow. Come on, he's going to the notice board. If you want to see how quickly news travels, that's where you'll find out. Outside, the winter air slaps the heat off your skin, replacing it with a clean bite of frost. The square has shifted in tone. Stalls are closing, shadows are longer, and the smell of bread is fading into smoke from evening fires. The inspector stops at a thick oak post near the square's center, pulls a folded parchment from his ledger, and pins it under a nail with the flat of his palm. You can smell the iron of the nail, the faint animal scent of the parchment. Within seconds, 2 children dart up to read it, their eyes widening before they scamper off, No doubt to spread the news like free samples. That's it, you say. No town crier? The baker shakes his head. The board works faster. People will be quoting it over supper before the hour's out. You catch the headline short, all in blocky script. Underweight loaf, 1 ounce. Below it, the baker's name. No embellishment, just fact. Somehow it feels worse that way. You glance toward the platform where the bells still hang, catching the last of the sun. The punishment bells stay quiet for now, but their shapes seem darker in the dusk, like they're waiting for tomorrow. The baker's voice is low. Best hope he makes good bread next week. Folks forgive, but they never forget the sound. And just as you turn to leave, the wind carries the faintest metallic hum from the forge Ulrich's hammer on another bell, reminding you that justice here is measured not just in weight, but in tone. The parchment flaps lazily in the cold wind as the last of the daylight drains from the square. The inspector walks off with the same deliberate pace you've come to associate with someone who never, ever trips in public. The baker lingers, hands in his flour-dusted apron pockets, watching as the knot of gossip-hungry villagers dissolves into narrow side streets. You expect him to turn toward home, maybe mutter something bitter about the inspector under his breath. Instead, he tilts his head toward the darker end of the square, where a low wooden awning shelters a row of unlit stalls. You've seen the punishment, he says, voice just above a whisper. But have you seen the extra? The extra what? You ask. He grins. The hidden extra. You'll like this part. The wind chases a paper cup's worth of dry snow across the cobblestones as you follow him, boots echoing in the quiet. The smell here is different, less bread and more. Something nutty, earthy, almost sweet. You realize you're passing the spice seller's closed cart, its canvas flapping against the frame with a sound like tired applause. The baker ducks under the awning and stops at a squat table, pushed against the wall of the guild hall. A single oil lamp burns there, its wick low, painting the wood in orange pools of light. Behind it sits a woman with a ledger and a balance scale, the kind with 2 brass plates swinging gently in the draft. She looks up and says, "Well, if it isn't Master Rye and his shadow." "That's me," you say. "Lucky shadow," she says with a dry smile. "He's brought you to see the bit they don't post on the board." The baker gestures toward the ledger. "Show them." She flips it open to a page marked with a small red ribbon. You see rows of names, dates, weights, and next to some, a neat little plus sign. You raise an eyebrow. "Extra weight?" She nods. "When the bread weighs over." "Enough to notice. We record it here. A sort of reverse punishment." "You mean they get in trouble for giving too much bread?" The baker chuckles. "Not trouble, but it's suspicious. In the old days, a loaf heavier than regulation might mean you're hoarding grain somewhere, or trying to bribe customers with generosity. That's bizarre, you say. Bizarre, she agrees. But imagine if someone gave away triple the data storage for free. Wouldn't you wonder what they're getting out of it? You think of modern marketing gimmicks. Okay, fair point. She dips her quill in ink, its scratch on the paper sounding like someone gently tearing fabric. The extra is rare now. Back in the 14th century, they called it the baker's kindness, but they still watched it. Too much kindness, and you were either a saint or a smuggler. The baker leans on the table. During the 100 Years' War, there were towns where giving more bread than standard was seen as unpatriotic. Grain needed to last. Give too much away, and you were accused of helping the enemy eat well. You glance between them. That's the opposite of how I'd think generosity works. The woman smiles faintly. Historians still debate whether it was paranoia or practicality. She turns the ledger toward you again, tapping one line where a plus is followed by a single word, remarked. What's that mean? Means the extra was noticed publicly. Sometimes praised, sometimes mocked, depends who was listening. The baker adds, if the punishment bell was for the cheats, the extra got the whisper network. No clanging bronze. Just everyone in the tavern saying, "Did you hear so-and-so's loaves are over?" You imagine that being accused of generosity in a world where survival hangs on ounces of flour. The woman closes the ledger gently, as though even the binding might carry secrets. Weighing the hidden extra isn't just about fairness, it's about keeping the game even. Too much on either side tips the whole market. The lamp sputters, throwing the shadows longer, and you notice a small box tucked under the table. It's unlocked. Inside, you glimpse scraps of ribbon, each dyed a different color. What are those? She hesitates. The baker answers for her. Tokens. If someone's extra is especially generous but not dangerous, they get a ribbon tied to their stall. Public thank you without upsetting the balance. Like a verified checkmark. You ask, exactly, the baker says. Only no one fights about it on a message board. Well, not much. A gust of wind rattles the awning and the lamp flickers, briefly plunging the ledger into shadow. You can hear the faint creak of the balance plates swinging. The woman straightens her quill, then leans back. That's the extra. Not many. Outsiders get to see it. You feel the pull of curiosity, the sense that this is the quiet undercurrent beneath the clanging public bells. The invisible ledger of kindness and suspicion dot as you step back into the square. The smell of wood smoke wraps around you again. Somewhere far off, a single market bell rings once, not for punishment or praise, but simply to mark the hour. The baker glances toward the dim outline of the grain storehouses at the edge of town. If you think weighing bread is tricky, wait until you see how they weigh the grain itself. The thought settles in your mind like a warm, heavy stone as you follow him into the deepening night. The baker's boots crunch against the frost as he leads you down a narrow lane toward the hulking outline of the grain storehouses. The moonlight catches in the drifting snowflakes, making them sparkle like someone's just thrown glitter across the whole scene. The air here is colder, sharper. None of the warm bread smells of the square. Only the dry, dusty scent of raw flour and old wood. Somewhere nearby, you hear a muffled thud, like a heavy sack being dropped on a wooden floor, followed by the faint squeak of a pulley. "Keep your head down," the baker murmurs, not because there's real danger, but in that way people whisper when they want you to feel like there is. The storehouse doors are tall and iron-banded, but instead of going in through them, he guides you to a smaller side door. It opens with a soft groan, letting out a puff of warm, flower-scented air. Inside, the light is dim, coming from a single oil lamp hanging over a long bench. On it sits a set of oversized scales, heavier than the baker's back in the shop, with plates big enough to hold an entire sack. 3 men are bent over the bench, sleeves rolled up, forearms dusted white. They look up briefly, then keep working. One unties the throat of a burlap sack, letting grain spill slowly into a wide pan. The sound is like 1,000 tiny beads pattering against metal. "Evening," the baker says casually. A broad-shouldered man with a crooked nose nods. "Evening, who's the extra pair of eyes?" "Just a friend," the baker replies. You can see that this isn't just weighing, it's bargaining. Every time the grain hits the plate, they glance at one another, mutter numbers under their breath, then add or remove a handful. It's strangely hypnotic. Why the back and forth? You ask quietly. The baker smirks. Because no one wants to be the one who gave too much or too little. It's like splitting a pizza bill. Everyone pretends they don't care, but they're counting slices. A small man with a bristly beard looks up. "We're not just weighing grain, stranger. We're weighing favors." You blink. "Favors?" He nods, brushing flour dust from his fingers. "You give a little extra 1 week, maybe you get first. Pick when the better sacks arrive next week. You short someone today, maybe you don't get invited to the next shipment." The air is thick with a fine, almost sweet dust that sticks in your throat. Somewhere above, you hear a faint scrabbling noise, probably a rat. The crook-nosed man doesn't even look up. Ignore it. They're part of the furniture. The baker leans in, voice low. During the Great Fire of London, some warehouses burned because owners refused to move grain until payment was confirmed. It's not always about feeding people, it's about who owes who. The bristly bearded man adds, and who you can call on when the river freezes and the barges can't get through. You realize this isn't the open marketplace of the square. This is quieter, slower, but no less cutthroat. Deals are sealed, with nods and tiny scoops of grain, like poker players pushing chips across the table. Historians still debate. The baker says softly, whether these bargains kept towns alive during shortages or just made the powerful richer. The crook-nosed man grins. Both. Definitely both. You watch as a final handful of grain is added to a sack, tipping the scale just so. A scrap of paper is marked, the sack is tied, and the deal is done. No shouting, no clanging bells, just the soft rustle of burlap and the creak of wood as another sack is set aside. The lamp overhead sways slightly in a draft, sending shadows sliding over the walls. The air feels warmer now, but heavier too, as if the very dust carries the weight of old debts. Not all trades are this polite. The baker remarks as you step back into the cold. Sometimes flour isn't traded for flour. You raise an eyebrow. What else? He smiles thinly. Wait until you see the market where bread's bought with songs. The wind lifts a veil of snow between you, and for a moment, the storehouse looms like a silent witness to centuries of whispered deals, watching as you head toward that next strange exchange. The wind follows you down another narrow street, funneling between stone walls until it feels like it's trying to push you backward. The baker walks ahead, his shoulders hunched, his breath fogging the air in rhythmic bursts. You notice the streets here are darker, not just from the lack of lanterns, but from the shadow of the cathedral looming over everything. Its bell tower stands like a sentinel, pale against the night sky. You catch the faint sound of singing, not the clear, joyful kind, but low, almost murmured, like a prayer that's lost its way home. The baker turns down an even smaller alley, and the air changes. You smell wood smoke, cabbage, and something sweet, like honey that's been warmed just enough to loosen. A little courtyard opens up, lit by the dull red glow of braziers and the flicker of candles behind narrow windows. People are gathered here, wrapped in rough cloaks, faces red from cold. At the center stands a trestle table, and behind it a woman with a ladle, her apron already smeared with flour. Loaves sit piled beside her, small, dark and dense. This, the baker says, is bread the church gives away. You step closer. The ground underfoot packed with frozen mud. A child tugs on your sleeve, looking up with wide eyes. It's better when it's still warm, she whispers. The woman with the ladle glances at you. You helping or watching? Helping, the baker answers for you, already grabbing 2 loaves and passing them across the table to an old man whose hands tremble slightly. You join in, passing loaves, feeling their surprising weight. Each is wrapped in a scrap of cloth, and the smell is richer than you expected. Rye, molasses, maybe even a hint of spice. These are heavier than market loaves, you remark. The baker nods. Because here, weight means survival, not fines. A man with a thin, clever face leans in. Don't think it's all charity, he says. A fat loaf can make a hungry man loyal. You glance at the baker, who just shrugs as if to say, he's not wrong. The singing starts again, closer this time, just a few voices, carrying a melody that sounds older than the street itself. It weaves between the sounds of footsteps, the soft thud of loaves being stacked, and the occasional crackle from the brazier. The baker explains in a low tone. During the Black Death, these tables fed more than prayers ever could. But there were whispers. Some claimed certain families got bigger rations if they had friends in the right pew. You hand a loaf to a boy whose mittens are more whole than wool. His smile is quick and sharp, gone before you can even hand him the cloth. Wrapping, the cold bites at your ears, but the heat of the loaves in your hands makes it feel almost bearable. A woman with a face like weathered leather takes her bread and presses your fingers briefly in thanks. Historians still debate. The baker says, whether church bread lines were acts of mercy or just a way to keep the poor dependent. The clever-faced man from earlier chuckles. And they'll keep debating until they're the ones in line. You keep passing loaves until the table is bare, save for crumbs and the faint smell of caraway. The brazier's smoke drifts upward, catching in the curls of snow that start to fall again as the crowd thins. The baker pockets a scrap of parchment from the woman with the ladle. You catch a glimpse, a list of names. Some are crossed out. What's that, you ask? People who didn't show, he says. And people who'll get a little extra next time if they bring something in trade. What can they trade? He smiles faintly. Not always grain. Sometimes just a bit of news. Or a promise. The last candle in the courtyard gutters out, and you follow the baker back into the night. The cathedral bells give a single heavy toll in the distance, one note, hanging in the cold air like it's marking something you can't quite name. You can't help wondering what other kinds of bread were given away in this town, and what was expected in return, especially in the places where no bells rang to announce it. The baker's pace quickens, and you have to match his stride as the street curves away from the cathedral's shadow. The air shifts still cold, but carrying a different weight now, tinged with cinnamon and the faint scorch of pine torches. You hear it before you see it, the distant clash of tambourines, the occasional hoot, a laugh that rings out sharp before being swallowed by the night. Somewhere ahead, the quiet charity of the bread line is about to be replaced by noise and color. You step into a lane that glows in shifting pockets of light torches set into iron brackets, paper lanterns swinging lazily overhead. The cobbles here are slick with melted snow, reflecting the yellows and reds like spilled ink. It's warmer, not because the wind has stopped, but because the press of bodies soaks into the stones. There, the baker says, nodding toward. A stall that doesn't just smell like bread. It smells like a festival you didn't know was scheduled. The air is thick with honeyed dough, roasted nuts, and something faintly citrus. A large round loaf sits at the center, dusted with sugar. So fine it glitters under torchlight. It's huge, more centerpiece than food, and the surface is patterned in braids and knots. Looks like something you'd post on Instagram and then not eat, you say, or eat entirely and then regret. The baker replies without missing a beat. A woman in a crimson shawl leans over the counter, slicing pieces from the loaf with a knife that catches the firelight. The slice she hands to the next customer is warm enough to steam in the cold air. The scent is richer than the loaves and the courtyard eggs, butter, maybe even saffron if your nose isn't imagining it. This is festival bread, the baker explains, made once a year. Some say it's a blessing in flour form. Others say it's just an excuse to charge double. You watch as a boy, barely tall enough to see over the counter, trades a small carved whistle for a chunk of the loaf. The woman accepts it with a nod and tucks the whistle into a pouch at her waist. Not always coin, the baker says, catching your look. Festival time is when trades get creative. The tambourines rattle closer now, joined by a deep drumbeat that feels like it's under your feet. You spot a group of dancers in brightly patched tunics, their boots kicking up little sprays of melted snow. One of them balances a tray of the loaf slices on his head while spinning. People cheer. And somehow he doesn't drop a single piece. Historically, the baker tells you, festival loaves have been around longer than most market laws. He mentions the bread baked in Paris in 1789, the year the French Revolution erupted, loaves shaped like liberty caps, given out in public squares. Bread as politics, he says, with icing sugar. The woman in the crimson shawl catches. your eye and beckons you over. First time? She asks, her voice carrying just enough amusement to make you feel slightly exposed. First time for this loaf. You answer. She slides a slice onto a square of parchment and presses it into your hands. The heat seeps through instantly, and the sugar dust clings to your gloves. You take a bite, soft, rich, the kind of thing you'd tell yourself you'll save half of, and then eat entirely before you get home. Careful, she warns. Some slices have coins baked in for luck. That sounds like a dental lawsuit. Waiting to happen, you mutter. The baker grins. Better than the old days. Once, they hid dried beans in the loaf, and whoever got it had to host the next feast. It could bankrupt you. A fiddler starts up nearby, the notes quick and sharp, and the crowd shifts toward the music. You notice people holding their slices like tickets, nibbling slowly as though making the warmth last. Historians still debate. The baker says whether these festival loaves began as offerings to saints, or if they were just clever marketing by bakers looking to move the last of their winter flour. A tall man with a painted mask leans in suddenly, holding out a chunk of bread with a wink. Trade? He asks. For what? You say. He tilts his head toward your scarf. That's a fine color. You laugh and shake your head, but the baker nudges you. Careful, he says quietly. One trade here can set off 10 more you didn't mean to make. As you watch, a woman exchanges a slice for a ribbon, the ribbon for a tiny vial of perfume, the perfume for a brass button, and finally the button for another slice of bread. It's like the whole square is caught in a loop of flour-based bartering. The drumming grows louder, the dancers faster, the air warmer from the swirl of bodies. You notice that the big loaf on the counter is nearly gone, the braided patterns reduced to crumbs. The woman in the crimson shawl is already pulling another from a cloth-lined basket, steam curling up in the cold night air. You feel the baker's hand on your shoulder. Enjoy the music, he says, but don't fill up too much. Why? His eyes flick toward the far end of the square, where a line of torchlight snakes away into the dark. Because the night isn't over, and there's one more kind of bread you need to see, though it's not exactly sold in daylight. The drumbeat follows you as you turn, the taste of sugar and saffron still warm in your mouth, and the torches ahead beckoning like the start of another story. The torches dwindle the farther you go from the square, the laughter behind you dissolving into a muffled hum. Here, the snow hasn't melted. It crunches under your boots like brittle parchment. Your breath comes out in thick plumes, and the cold starts to pinch your fingertips again. The baker walks ahead with purpose, his shoulders hunched, his pace quick, not hurried, exactly, but with the rhythm of someone who knows the night has a schedule. You notice that the line of light you saw earlier isn't torches anymore, it's lanterns, the kind with wooden frames and thin oiled paper, each glowing like a muted ember. They sway gently from doorways and hooks, marking out a narrow back street. The air changes again, this time tinged with yeast and that unmistakable toasty scent of bread pulled from the oven. Minutes ago, the baker stops at a door that looks like it should belong to a stable rather than a kitchen. He raps twice, waits, then once more, different rhythm. You're about to make a joke about secret knocks when the door opens, just enough for a sliver of yellow light to spill onto the snow. A man with flour in his eyebrows peers out. Late, he says. Festival, the baker replies simply. Stepping inside, the heat hits you immediately, thick and damp, like walking into a sauna that smells of rye, wheat, and faint wood smoke. It's a long, narrow room, the walls dark with years of steam, and in the far corner, a massive brick oven glows faintly orange. You catch sight of 3 people working in near silence, one rolling dough with forearms dusted white to the elbows, another weighing small loaves on a brass scale, and a third loading the oven with a peel so long it could double as a medieval jousting lance. The only sound, aside from the occasional scrape of metal on wood, is the soft thud of dough hitting the bench. So this, you murmur, is the bread equivalent of an after-hours club? The baker smirks. Not everyone can wait for the morning bell. You learn quickly that night bakers aren't here for festival flair. They're here for necessity. Dock workers who leave at dawn, travelers slipping through town, servants sent out under orders to fetch fresh loaves before sunrise. And less officially, a few people who prefer their transactions unrecorded. A woman at the scale glances up. Half for coin, half for arrangements, she says. Arrangements? You ask, deliveries, favors, information. She slides a small loaf toward you without breaking eye contact. Sometimes a loaf is a loaf, sometimes it's a message in crust. She's not kidding. You watch her wrap a round loaf in cloth, knotting it in a way that feels deliberate. She tucks a thin scrap of parchment into the fold before handing it off to a man in a dark cloak. No words exchanged. He's gone before the oven door closes again. Historically, the baker tells you night baking wasn't just about freshness, it was about survival. During the Great Fire of London in 1666, flames spread so quickly partly because many bakers worked by night, their ovens already blazing when the first sparks caught. One baker's shop in Pudding Lane, he says, lit up more than the loaves. The man rolling dough looks up and chuckles. And they've blamed us for that ever since. The warmth in here makes your eyelids heavy, the steady rhythm of work almost hypnotic. You notice the smell shifting, slightly, one batch done, another on its way. The new dough carries a sharper, almost sour note. Rye, the baker explains. Keeps longer, cheaper to make. Also, he leans in, harder for rats to chew through without breaking their teeth. That's oddly reassuring, you reply. He shrugs. Not everything in baking is romantic. A boy no older than 12 darts past you, balancing a tray of rolls like it's the crown jewels. He slips out a side door, the cold air rushing in before the heat swallows it again. Delivery? You ask. Likely to the watchman, the baker says. You keep the guards happy, they don't. Ask why you're baking past curfew. In the corner, the woman at the scale is now weighing something heavier than bread. A small sack that clinks faintly. She exchanges it for 3 loaves, each one marked with a shallow cut on the top, an identifier. Maybe, or a warning. You're tempted to ask. But the baker shakes his head just enough for you to know that's not a conversation for strangers. Hours slide by in a haze of steam, the glow of the oven painting everyone in warm gold. Every now and then, the outside door opens, letting in a slice of black night before sealing it away again. You find yourself lulled into the rhythm. Dough slap, scale scrape, oven hiss. Repeat. Historians still debate, the baker says quietly at one point, whether night baking was more about convenience or control. A way for bakers to dominate. The early market, or a way to serve those who couldn't or wouldn't buy by day. Maybe both, you say, exactly. By the time the last batch is cooling, the first hints of pale gray are creeping into the cracks around the shutters. The baker hands you a small, still warm roll. On the house, he says, it's dense, slightly tangy, the crust thin but firm. You imagine it slipping into a satchel alongside letters, coins, or something less legal. Outside, the cold feels sharper after the heat inside, and the street is nearly empty, except for a milk cart rattling by. The baker tugs his coat tighter. One more stop, he says, but this one's not for selling. You follow the quiet crunch of snow underfoot, and the lingering scent of rye, hinting that the next bread you'll meet has a purpose that goes beyond hunger. The snow underfoot turns to gritty slush as you follow the baker down a narrow lane that feels less like part of the city and more like something the city forgot. The windows here are small and shuttered, the rooftops hunched together as if conspiring. You pass a frozen water trough, its surface fractured into jagged glassy plates, and a stack of firewood so neatly arranged it almost feels like the owner is showing off. Then you hear it, a faint, deliberate clang. Not the random clatter of dropped pans, but a slow, measured chime, the kind that seems to echo longer than the air should allow. Another follows, lower in tone, with a mellow hum that lingers in your chest. The sound is oddly warm, like the voice of someone who always knows what to say. The baker stops before a squat, timber-framed building. Above the door, a weathered wooden sign swings gently. It's shaped like a bell, no words, just the form. He pushes open the door, and the smell hits you first. Metal, hot and sharp, undercut with the faint sweetness of beeswax and something smoky charcoal, maybe. The air is warmer than the street, but not the soft heat of a bakehouse. It's a dry, almost brittle warmth, like the air over a candle flame magnified 100 times. Inside, the shop is both cluttered and ordered. Bells hang from beams like a flock of heavy bronze birds. Tiny ones no bigger than walnuts, great ones you could stand inside, and dozens in between. Some gleam as if freshly polished. Others are dulled to a dignified green patina. The floor is littered with curls of metal shavings and bits of broken molds. Somewhere in the back, the steady hiss and crackle of a forge breathes life into the space. A man with shoulders as broad as a cartwheel steps forward. His apron is scorched in patches, his hair a wild halo of gray that looks like it's been trying to escape his head for years. "You're late," he says, not to you, but to the baker. "Festival," the baker replies again, with the same nonchalance he used on the night bakers. The bellmaker grunts, wiping his hands on the apron. "And this?" He nods toward you. "Extra pair of eyes," the baker says, "for the selection." "Selection?" You glance upward at the hanging forest of bells. "You mean these?" The bellmaker's gaze narrows. "Every loaf weighed must have a true measure," he says, "and every measure needs a sound that can't be faked." He reaches for a medium-sized bell and gives it a gentle strike with a small hammer. The tone blooms through the room, pure and unwavering, lingering just long enough to make the silence afterward feel like an absence. You can't help but compare it to those novelty doorbells that play tinny pop songs. This one could silence a room faster than a principal's cough in a school assembly. He gestures you closer to a workbench where a half-finished bell rests on its side, still warm enough that you can feel the heat radiating. The surface is rough, pitted with tiny craters from casting. Beside it, small lumps of tin and copper sit ready for melting. "You know," he says, "in 1752, when the calendar skipped 11 days. "Oh, right," you interrupt. "When people supposedly rioted shouting, 'Give us back our days.'" He smirks. "That's the one." Bells rang across England to mark the change. Some folks thought it was a conspiracy. Others thought the bells were calling down bad luck. Truth is, bell makers made a tidy sum replacing cracked ones after the celebrations. The baker leans against the bench. And some bakers learned the hard way that a bell out of tune meant suspicion on the scales. The bell maker nods. Metal contracts in the cold. Ring the wrong note and you're accused of cheating. A good bell keeps you honest if you want to be. Historians still debate whether the link between bells and bakers' measures started as law or simply as a trusted custom. Either way, the practice stuck like dough in a cooling pan. You wander further into the shop, careful not to bump anything. The bells nearest the forge glow faintly gold from the firelight, their shadows looping across the rafters. A small bell with an oddly high pitch catches your ear. "Too much tin," the bell maker says from behind you. "Makes it brittle." Sounds nice though, like a polite sneeze. You imagine slipping one into a pocket, just to test how long it would take someone to notice, probably less than a minute, given the way his eyes track you. A side table is crowded with molds in various shapes. Some clearly for bells, others for things you can't identify, tiny animals, miniature towers, even what looks suspiciously like a loaf of bread. Commission work? You ask. The bell maker chuckles. Sometimes the church pays, sometimes the guild. Sometimes a baker wants a mark only his customers know. The baker joins in, once saw a bell shaped like a goose. No one ever explained why. You picture a bakery where every loaf is weighed under the honk of a bronze goose and stifle a laugh. The bell maker starts working as you watch, moving with the careful speed of someone who has made the same motions for decades. He stirs molten metal in a crucible, the surface shimmering like a liquid sunset. The hiss when he pours it into a mold is sharper than steam from an oven, the air filling with a metallic tang that clings to the back of your throat. Not all bells are for weighing, he says over the sound. Some are for warnings, some for blessings, and some, he lowers his voice, are for signals. Signals, you realize, that could carry further and faster than a whispered word in the street. In one corner, a tall, narrow bell hangs alone. The tone it gives off when tapped is low enough you feel it in your bones rather than hear it. That one, the bell maker says, was meant for foggy mornings on the river. Could be heard for miles. The baker gives a short nod, as if confirming something between them. You begin to suspect this stop wasn't just about purchasing a bell for bread weighing. When the forging is done, the bell maker brings out a finished piece of modest size. Its surface smooth, the clapper polished bright. He hands it to the baker, who tests it with a single crisp ring. The sound is clean, almost sweet, and somehow final, like the period at the end of a sentence. That's the one, the baker says. Coins change hands, but you notice a folded scrap of parchment slipping between them as well. No one acknowledges it. Outside again, the morning light is turning the snow to silver. The baker tucks the bell into his satchel, the faint jingle making it sound like there's a secret in there trying to get out. You walk on, the cold air clearing. The forge's metallic tang from your throat, and you can't help wondering, who exactly will be listening for that ring? The baker keeps a pace just shy of brisk, as if he knows you're still digesting the metallic hum of the bellmaker's shop. Frosted rooftops stretch ahead, their edges glowing faintly as the low winter sun decides it's finally worth showing up to work. The air is sharper now, the kind that seems to whistle past your ears, and you can smell chimney smoke layering over the colda, scent equal parts comfort and reminder that this isn't just a leisurely morning stroll. Your boots scuff over cobblestones that have been polished by centuries of feet, cartwheels, and the occasional horse that probably regretted running downhill here. You notice how the street subtly broadens as you go, and the shops change, narrow bakeries giving way to stalls piled with spices, dried fish, woolens, and glass beads that wink in the pale light. Somewhere behind it all, the bell in the baker's satchel gives the faintest jingle with each step, like it's clearing its throat before saying something important. Where are we headed now? You ask. North Gate, the baker says. Market square's only half the trade. Some things cross borders better than they cross streets. You raise an eyebrow. Bread crosses borders? Bread, he says, and the news that rides with it. The wind tugs at your cloak as you pass under an archway darkened with soot. Beyond it, the sounds shift, more clatter, more voices, and a rolling murmur that's distinctly less local. Accents you can't place, snippets of languages you've only heard when travelers pass through. A group of fur-capped merchants laugh loud enough to turn heads. A boy hurries past with a bundle of parchment strapped to his back, like a quiver of arrows. It smells different here, too, less of ovens and more of things, packed tightly in barrels for weeks. Salted fish, smoked meat, sharp cheeses wrapped in cloth, and something pungent that might be fermented. Cabbage or might be someone's boots. The baker steers you toward a cluster of wagons just inside the gate. The horses are draped with thick blankets, their breath puffs like small steam engines. One driver sits perched high, drinking from a flask that, judging by his expression, could strip paint. You've got it? A man near the wagons asks the baker in a low voice. The baker taps his satchel. And the loaves? The man gestures to a covered basket. You catch a glimpse of round, dense loaves the color of dark wood. They speak in the rhythm of people who don't want to be overheard quick. Clipped exchanges, a pause long enough to listen for footsteps, then on again. Rye? You say, partly to join in and partly to cut the tension. Travel's better than wheat. The baker replies, and won't mold as fast. Also doubles as currency if you find the right border guard. You picture a customs officer being bribed with a loaf of bread and wonder if that's still more dignified than handing over a gift. Card in today's world. The man with the basket chuckles. We've seen loaves traded for shoes, knives, even a half sack of salt. Once, in '09, a single sourdough bought safe passage for an entire caravan. 1809, you ask. He nods. Napoleonic mess. Soldiers hungry on both sides. A loaf's worth more than a treaty when your stomach's empty. It makes sense, though it's sobering to think that during wars, bread could cross lines that soldiers couldn't. The baker checks one loaf, thumbing the crust like he's reading it. Dense. Enough, he says. Won't break in the cart. They swap baskets and satchels in a move so smooth you almost miss it. The faint jingle of the bell inside is swallowed by the creak of wagon wheels as one cart rolls toward the open road. A pair of women nearby are selling flatbreads rolled around something steaming. The smell is spicy sweet, and the baker buys one without hesitation, handing you half. It's hot enough to sting your fingertips. The bread is chewy, the filling warm and unfamiliar spiced lentils, maybe with a kick of something peppery. Where's this from? You ask between bites. Across the river, 2 days' ride, the seller says with pride. Same recipe for 5 generations. My grandmother's grandmother served it to a duke who claimed it was better than any roast. Historians still debate, the baker murmurs with a grin, whether she was flattered or just amused enough not to raise the price. You walk with him toward a long table where maps are weighed down with river stones. Traders trace routes with calloused fingers, marking where ice has made crossings risky. A man with ink-stained hands rolls up a parchment and tucks it into a loaf-shaped bundle, tying it so neatly you wouldn't think to question it. Letters, the baker says quietly. Harder to search bread than saddlebags. You imagine the moment at some distant border when a soldier slices into a loaf, expecting contraband, only to find rye crumbs and disappointment. From somewhere further down the market comes the rhythmic thud of a stamp, someone sealing documents with wax. It mixes oddly with the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the cries of sellers hawking wares, and the occasional bark of a dog that seems convinced. Every cart is a personal threat. The baker stops beside a stall where the merchant's wares are. Nothing but bread rows of it, each a slightly different shade and shape. Round loaves with braided tops, long slender sticks dusted with flour. Squat buns glazed to a soft shine. This one, the baker says, pointing to a pale loaf, is from across the western hills. No yeast, just the air and patience. You tear off a piece and taste it. The texture is dense but not unpleasant. The flavor tangy in a way that reminds you of yogurt. It's like bread that's been doing yoga. You say, quietly intense. The merchant laughs. Fermented for days. Travelers swear it keeps them warm. There's a sudden commotion near the gate, shouts in 2 different languages, the clatter of boots. A man carrying a sack of grain is being questioned by 2 guards, their halberds angled just enough to discourage movement. The baker watches for a moment, then turns away. Not our concern today, he says, but his tone suggests he's measuring how fast that could change. You pass a small shrine at the edge of the square, its roof dusted with frost. Someone has left a loaf there, wrapped in cloth, the crust split as if it had been broken, but not eaten. The baker's glance lingers a second longer than yours before he moves on. By the time you loop back toward the quieter streets, the cold has deepened again, the smell of spices and smoke fading behind you. The baker's satchel no longer jingles. Bell wrapped in cloth now, but the weight of it seems more noticeable. You sense you're heading somewhere more private again. And the thought occurs, Maybe bread doesn't just cross borders, it erases them. The streets pinch narrower again, the cheerful chaos of the market shrinking to a quiet you could almost feel in your teeth. Here the walls lean in like gossips, their plaster flaking in pale curls, and the air is damp enough to smell of moss and yesterday's rain. The baker's stride doesn't slow, but you catch the subtle hitch of someone taking the long way around, not for scenery, but for discretion. You notice the shift first in sound, the distant chatter replaced by the flat slap of your boots on wet stone, the occasional drip of water from a gutter. A black cat watches you from a windowsill, eyes bright as polished coal, tail flicking once like punctuation. Somewhere ahead, a single bell tolls, deep, deliberate. The sort of note that doesn't just tell time, it warns you it's keeping track. Courthouse? You ask. Guildhall, the baker says. And the scales. The words hang there, heavier than they should be. When you turn the last corner, the building rises out of the street like it's been waiting centuries to catch someone lying. Its arched windows are high and mean-looking, the stonework dark with soot. A carved loaf of bread above the doorway seems cheerful at first glance, until you notice the scales beneath it, balanced, yes, but carved with such precision, they might as well be accusing you personally. Inside, it's colder than the street, the kind of cold that isn't just about temperature, but about rules. The floor is worn to a sheen, every footstep echoing like it's tattling on you. Long benches flank the hall, most empty except for a few figures hunched like they'd rather be anywhere else. At the far end, a table groans under the weight of loaves. Not metaphorically, there's an actual groan as the wood strains. Dark, rye, pale wheat, braided chow like knots, flatbread stacked like scrolls. Behind the table stands a man in a fur-lined robe, his head shiny as if the hair gave up and left decades ago. Beside him, a set of brass scales gleam under a narrow shaft of light, each weight polished so bright it's almost smug. Name? The robed man asks, not looking up from a list. The baker gives it, calm as if ordering lunch. And the loaf? The baker sets a round, flour-dusted loaf on the table. The man lifts it, turning it in his hands with the slow suspicion of someone checking for trick hinges. Then he sets it on the scale. The needle trembles, settles, and the man frowns. Light, he says. By how much? The baker asks, a dram. You don't know exactly how much a dram is, but from the baker's expression, it's small enough to be maddening. That's the flour this hall's draft steals while you weigh it, the baker says dryly. A low chuckle ripples from one of the benches. Quickly smothered. The man ignores it, pulling out a little brass bell. He strikes it. Gently, its tone rings out clear and sharp, the kind of sound that could cut through gossip. A clerk writes something down, and the loaf is set aside like evidence. You glance at the other loaves. Some are tagged with neat slips of parchment, others left bare like they're awaiting judgment. One is split open, the crumb inside suspiciously. Hollow, that one, the baker murmurs to you, was caught with stones baked into the bottom, adds weight. Chips teeth. It's not the sort of scam you'd expect to be creative enough for a crime drama, but apparently bread fraud has its own genre. A woman steps up next, her loaf heavy enough to thump when placed on the scale. The needle swings, then dips perfectly. Level. The man in the robe nods once. No bell. The loaf is set to the side. That innocent pile, you guessed out. It feels almost absurd. Watching bread treated like a lineup of suspects, but the stakes are sharper than the air in here. Short-weight bread isn't just cheating customers, it's skimming survival off people's plates. In times like the 1315 famine, the difference between a legal loaf and a light one could be life or death. The baker leans slightly toward you. In '66 they hanged a miller for skimming flour, he says quietly. 1666? You whisper back. He nods. Year of the Great Fire, too. City burned, but the records kept the miller's sentence neat as a ledger. You're half impressed. half disturbed that a city in flames still had time to weigh bread and hang someone over it. The robed man calls the next name, and the process continues: loaf, scale, verdict. You realize this is less a trial and more a ritual, every part of it built to be seen. Even the sound of the weights hitting the pan is deliberate, a dull, certain clink. Historians still debate. The baker says whether this was about fairness or about keeping bakers scared enough not to think of skimming. The bell rings again, another loaf light. This time the owner protests. It was the damp, he insists. Took the flour right out of the dough. The robed man raises an eyebrow. So your flour evaporated before baking? There's a beat of silence. Someone on the bench snorts. The baker catches your eye and murmurs, "You'd be surprised how many try that one." When it's over, the loaves are divided. The good ones stamped with a seal. The bad ones either confiscated or, if they're safe enough, sold at a penalty. You suspect the confiscated ones don't go to waste, but no one here is saying where they end up. As you step back out into the pale daylight, the bell in the baker's satchel shifts with a muted clink, like it's reminding both of you that judgment doesn't always come with scales and robes. The air feels warmer after the hall's chill, but the silence between you carries the echo of that brass bell, ready to ring again somewhere less official. The baker doesn't speak for the first dozen paces after leaving the guild hall, as though words might still carry the hall's cold weight if spoken too soon. The street opens wider, letting in a pale spill of winter sunlight, and you feel it land on your face like a tepid cup of tea, not exactly warm, but enough to remind you warmth exists. The satchel at his side clinks softly with every step, the muffled bell like a heartbeat under blankets. You watch his expression, calm on the surface, but with the faint pinch of someone doing mental math. Not numbers, exactly. Something subtler. Reputation arithmetic. "You know what costs more than flour?" he says suddenly. "What?" "You. Ask people believing your loaf weighs what you say it does." He takes a turn into a lane where the cobbles are sunken in the middle, puddles shining like dull mirrors. Here, laundry lines sag overhead, scraps of blue and cream cloth swaying, giving the whole street the look of a half-hearted festival. A chicken ambles by, tilting its head at you like it knows a secret. The smell changes, less smoke, more yeast. And roasted grain. Somewhere nearby, a fresh bake is cooling. The crust smells sweet enough to make your stomach stage a small protest. That's why the hall's so strict. The baker continues. "One light loaf, and it's not just the fine, it's whispers. They travel faster than carts. You think about modern equivalents. One bad online review tanking a 5-star rating. Or that time your delivery pizza showed up folded in half, like it had been through an emotional breakdown. What's the fix?" You ask, not getting caught. He says without smiling. Then, after a pause, or never cheating in the first place. But some think that's too expensive. You pass a small alehouse where the door stands open to let the brewing steam escape. Inside, men in rough cloaks sit elbow to elbow, tankards in hand, their laughter like rolling barrels. A woman near the doorway nods at the baker in greeting. "Get weighed today?" she asks. He nods once. "How'd you fare?" "Light," he admits. Her eyebrows rise, but she only says, "Could happen to anyone," before stepping aside to serve another customer. When you walk on, you notice the way two men at the far table lean their heads together, glancing toward the door you just exited. The baker notices too. "That's it," he says quietly. "That's the damage." You don't need to be guilty for the talk to start. The road curves toward the river. You hear the soft slap of water against stone, and the creak of ropes on moored boats. The air here carries the mingled sense of wet hemp, fish scales, and baking bread from some unseen window. He tells you about the assize of bread and ale, how in medieval England, the law fixed not the price, but the weight of bread for a given. Cost of wheat. Raise the price of wheat. The law made your loaf lighter, legally. Lower it, and customers got more for their penny. Sounds fair. You say, sounds fair, he echoes, until you remember who measured the wheat. You spot a boy carrying a tray of rolls, the golden crusts gleaming in the cold light. He keeps the tray tipped slightly toward himself, as though guarding it from invisible thieves. That lad's master, the baker says, hasn't been weighed in 3 months. Customers think he's honest because they never hear otherwise. But I've seen him shave off enough to feed a family. Historians still debate, he adds, whether the law created honesty or just gave dishonest men a more complicated game. You stop at a small square dominated by a stone cross, the base worn smooth by centuries of leaning elbows. Here, vendors sell not bread, but trust candles blessed by a local saint, amulets promising safe childbirth, charms to keep rats out of grain stores. It's a marketplace of belief, and somehow it feels related to what the baker has been telling. He pauses to buy a twist of salt wrapped in paper. For the crust, he explains, and for the eyes. Looks richer than it is. There's a faint murmur from a corner where 3 old men sit in a patch of weak sun. You catch a snatch of their conversation. Light loaf. Always said so. Before the words dissolve into coughs. Proof travels on foot, the baker mutters, but suspicion rides a horse. You imagine how a single Guildhall verdict could ripple through a town, the regular customers pausing just a second too. Long before ordering, the competition suddenly cheerful in their greetings, the children sent to fetch bread from somewhere else, just for today. You pass a shuttered shop whose sign is faded, but still legible. A painted loaf with a scale beneath it. The baker glances at it once and keeps walking. What happened there? You ask. They lost the seal 3 years back, he says. Still. Sold bread for a while, then customers stopped coming. You can't weigh trust back into a loaf once it's gone. The wind picks up, rattling the loose shutter so it sounds like a wooden heart skipping beats dot. By the time you turn toward the next lane, the bell in his satchel bumps against the side with a soft metallic sigh. He doesn't seem to notice, or maybe he does and just chooses not to show it. You're beginning to see that the bell isn't just for catching cheats. It's also a reminder that being honest isn't enough. People have to believe you are. And that belief can be as fragile as the crust on a fresh loaf crack at once, and it never seals the same way again. Somewhere ahead, you hear music a thin, reedy tune that doesn't belong to any market you've passed today. It carries on. The wind curling between the houses like it's looking for you. The baker adjusts his satchel, and you follow, the sound leading you toward whatever waits in the next street. The music pulls you forward, lilting like someone's whistling through a cracked reed. You and the baker slip into the next lane, where the sunlight narrows again into ribbons between tall timber-bird houses. The air changes cooler, touched by the damp edge of river wind, but also warmer in pockets where open shutters let out the breath of baking ovens. The sound resolves into a street performer, a boy in a patched cloak, playing a pipe that has clearly seen better centuries. His dog, thin but spry, keeps time by tapping its paw on the cobblestones. Though whether intentionally or just from excitement, you can't quite tell. A small crowd lingers, more for the novelty than the melody. You hear that tune in winter. The baker says quietly, they call it the oven song. Why? Because when the flour's low and the days are short, people sing about summer bread to keep their hands warm. It's strange to think of bread seasons, but here it's as real as the change in wind. Spring dough rises slow with the chill. Summer loaves are puffed and golden before the bell's echo fades. Autumn bread smells richer from the year's harvest. And winter, well, winter is when you get creative or you go hungry. You walk on, catching wafts of different ovens at work. One smells faintly of rye and smoke. Another has that sweet malt note that makes you think of modern cinnamon buns. Though here it's probably just barley flour pretending to be decadent. The baker glances upward as you pass a wooden sign carved with a sunburst. That's where we mark the first bake of summer, he says. Back when they lit the oven. Before dawn and half the town came to watch. You imagine it. People gathering like they might for a sports game now, except instead of jerseys. They wear aprons, and instead of a whistle, the game starts with a puff of flour dust in the air. Do you still do that? You ask. Sometimes, he says, but only when the harvest's been good enough to waste a little heat on ceremony. You step past a narrow alley where someone's hung a string of small bells. They chime faintly as the wind snakes through, like the memory of the guild hall following you. The baker's eyes flick toward them, but he keeps walking, dotting one square. A woman is shaping loaves on a table dusted white. Her sleeves are rolled to the elbow, and her forearms glisten with flour paste. She nods to the baker. Winter's coming. Quick, she says. So's my turn in the frost, he replies. You give him a look, and he explains. In cold months, the oven master takes turns guarding the fire. If it goes out, you lose a day's bread. It's the kind of job that sounds romantic until you remember you're basically standing next to a stone furnace at 2 in the morning, shoving wood in while frost paints the inside of your nose. Tells you how in 1315, a cold, wet summer across Europe ruined wheat crops. That was the Great Famine, 3 years when bread shrank, bellies hollowed, and even the wealthiest learned the taste of scarcity. Historians still debate whether that famine changed bread laws permanently, or just made people more suspicious. He says, the seasons dictate more than recipes here, they dictate trust too. In fat years, the scales are merciful. In lean years, every ounce is eyed like it might sprout legs and run away. A gust of wind sweeps through, carrying with it the sharp tang of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of apples baking somewhere unseen. It makes you think of autumn festivals, of stalls strung with lanterns and the sticky warmth of mulled cider. Best bread? You ask. Harvest loaves, he says without hesitation. Still warm from the oven, crust brushed with egg, seeds scattered so the birds get their share. That's when customers talk less about price and more about whether they can get a second loaf before it's gone. You round a bend where sunlight hits a row of drying herbs, sage, rosemary, thyme hung like green banners from every beam. Their smell cuts clean through the heavier scent of yeast and ash. A cat naps in the doorway of a bakery, tail curled over its nose, as if it has personally taste-tested every loaf and declared the day complete. The baker explains how ovens themselves change with the seasons. Summer heat makes the dough rise faster, but you have to watch for cracking crusts. Winter means slower proofing, but longer-lasting bread. And in spring, with damp in the air, the bread sometimes tastes faintly of whatever the walls have absorbed: smoke, ale, even fish if the storeroom shares space with a dockside wall. That's not appealing, you say. Neither is half the world. He shrugs. You stop near another stall where a man sells oven ash by the scoop. Apparently, it's prized for making soap and scrubbing pots. Nothing's wasted, the seller says. Cheerfully, you think of how modern bakeries might toss out stale bread, and the idea seems almost criminal here. Every crumb, every puff of steam has its place in the cycle. As you walk on, the baker tells you of a lesser-known tradition. In some towns, the first loaf of a new season wasn't eaten but buried in the field, feeding the earth, so the next harvest would be generous. The light begins to change, softening toward evening gold, and you realize you've been walking in a slow loop, each turn revealing another angle of ovens and the lives that revolve around them. The bell in his satchel stays quiet, but you feel it there, a reminder that no matter the season, the weight of bread is always under watch. Ahead, a new sound cuts through the calm. Not music this time, but the deep, deliberate clang of a hammer on metal. The baker's stride shifts just slightly, as though he knows exactly what forge that sound belongs to and what business might be waiting there. The hammer's rhythm leads you toward the mouth of a small square, its edges blurred by the deep amber wash of the lowering sun. You can feel that hour where heat leaves the stones underfoot, not in a rush, but like an old man easing himself. From a chair, the forge's glow bleeds across the cobbles, and for a moment, the air is half warm metal, half cooling bread. Somewhere in the space between those two scents, you catch the day's last exhale. The blacksmith is there broad-shouldered, hair silvered from age or ash, and he pauses just long enough to greet the baker with a nod. "Evening waits?" he says, voice pitched low, the way you'd talk to a friend who carries a sleeping child. The baker's reply is just as soft, one for the bell, the other for the season. You watch him hand over two small lumps of metal, dull from use. They vanish into the forge with a hiss, replaced after a time by shapes hammered true. The clang rings out, sharper now, echoing against the shop walls like the last few coins in a drawer. Inside the bakery, light shifts again, this time from sunset's gold to the thick orange of the oven's last fire. The heat hugs you at the door, like stepping off a chilly platform into an overpacked subway car. The scent is almost too much to stand still in. Yeast, caramelizing crust, a faint smoky undernote that feels like a memory of winter. End of the day, the baker says, is when the bread tells you if you listened. You look across the counter where cooling loaves rest. Some hum with trapped steam, others already silent. A tray of rolls wears the faint sheen of egg wash. Their tops crack in patterns that look almost deliberate, like little maps. "Do they all sell?" you ask. "Most," he says. "The rest, well, there's always tomorrow's pottage." You're about to ask what that tastes like when an older woman steps in, shawl wrapped tight. "I heard you've got one left," she says. "Two," he answers, "but one's promised." "I'll take the other." She sets her coin on the counter with the gentle finality of someone laying a card in a game they know they've won. He wraps the loaf in cloth, and for a moment, the whole place feels like it exists in a bubble. The hiss of the forge outside, the whisper of paper-thin crust settling, the faint rasp of cloth on wood. As she leaves, you notice the baker looking toward the oven. "Last light," he murmurs. It's not the sunset he means, it's the fire. The coals are slumping, their glow the slow heartbeat of the room. You can feel the temperature shifting, the day letting go. He tells you how in the Great Fire of London in 1666, bakeries were both accused and absolved. One spark in a pudding lane shop may have started it all. But rebuilding the city meant ovens were among the first to rise again. Historians still debate whether that fire changed safety laws or just changed where people built their ovens. He adds, sliding a peel into the embers to pull free the last loaf of the day. The lesser-known fact comes with a smile. Some bakers in cold towns used to tuck the day's final loaves under blankets to keep them warm for morning customers. "You think delivery pizza bags are clever," he says. "Try using your grandmother's quilt. You help carry a basket to the front, the wicker warm under your hands. The shop smells like comfort distilled, flour, wood, faint sugar, and the shadow of smoke. Outside, the forge has gone quiet, its heat still visible in the air like a mirage. Ever regret it? You ask. Only on the days when the scales lie, he says, glancing at the bell in his satchel. And only until the next loaf. A last customer drifts in, a boy with a copper coin, buying what's left of the rolls. The baker gives him an extra, saying simply, "For the road." The boy grins, a flash of teeth in the fading light, and slips away. You stand a moment longer, feeling the air cool at your back and warm at your face. The street outside is quieter now. Even the dog that followed the piper earlier is gone. The baker banked the fire, the sound a soft rustle of ash, and the oven's mouth fades from bright orange to muted red. He hangs his apron on a peg, movements unhurried, each knot and fold practiced into muscle memory. The bell stays in its place, silent. You step out with him into the square. The stones are cool now, the forge dark, the air carrying only the faintest scent of what the day made. Somewhere far off, a single bell tolls, not the guilds, not the bakers, just a mark of time passing. Your walk back is slow, each footstep measured to the rhythm of the cooling streets. The day is done, the last light folded away like the final loaf, and the story of bread, its weight, its watch, its seasons settles in your mind with the same quiet satisfaction as a full belly. Good night. End of script. Sweet dreams.